would have become intolerable. And then there were the Jews, who brought in their relentlessness, their curiosity, their hectic pursuit of wealth and of ideas, and their erratic rhythm and source of disorder. Just as the German influence made the United States a less exclusively English country, so too these two new influences made it less exclusively Protestant. A new America began to take shape, quite different from the first, and very different, as we soon shall see, from the third America, which was to follow it. Le Haute Mer of Berguet and Le Transatlantique of Abel Hermant illustrated this phase of US history. The third wave began in 1880 and went on until 1914. It was bigger and more important than the second, and it brought no less than 22 million souls into the country. And, make a special note of it, these elements were no longer Anglo-Saxon, but of Slavo-Latins. Mediterranean and Eastern European elements represented 70% of the total. The human beings who came into the country at this time were very different from their predecessors. The attraction which drew this great mass of human beings towards the United States was the high wages to be earned there. They were urged on by the desire to escape from the low standards of living which prevailed in the less developed parts of the old continent from which they came. It should be noted, too, that this was an organized immigration arranged either by the steamship companies or by special emigration societies, and to that extent there was a certain element of passivity about it. The newcomers were primarily poor people, most of them Catholics. They piled into the cheaper quarters of the big towns, too slow in their reactions to assimilate themselves. In this way, the old population did not lose its character, but was increased in numbers by decidedly heterogeneous elements. It was then that a problem arose in all its ramifications, one which America already knew, but which now became more acute. The problem of assimilating these immigrants who had been introduced into American life in large batches. 3 generations are necessary for the completion of the process. The first immigrant remains throughout his life a man of his own country of origin. He may learn to speak English, and of course, though he does not always do so, but if he does speak it, he speaks it with an accent. He may also dress like an American and try to live like an American, but one can see a long way off that he is not an American. His sons are different. They are educated at the local elementary schools and they speak only English. They are already more than half assimilated by their environment. If they are aware of their origin, they are rarely inclined to boast of it. They are more likely to look down on their parents and to repeat the denial of St. Peter. Their children, the third generation, are then totally assimilated. Even the memory of their European origin fades. The name has often become anglicized, and more than one Catholic or Jew has become a Methodist or an Anglican. If the type cannot become physically Anglo-Saxon, the manner is nevertheless now authentically American, and if some residue remains deep down, which has not been exercised by the fusion, it is merely a question of nuances visible only to penetrating analysis. And are we therefore entitled to say that America has assimilated the immigrants in her melting pot? To what extent has she really made these Italians, these Russians, these Balkans, these Germans proper Americans? If it is a question of appearances, then she has certainly succeeded. There is in an American way of speaking, feeling, acting, discussing, and behaving, and it is just as much found in the descendants of the last wave of emigrants as in the descendants of the 100% founders of the country. However, the influence of exotic element is still great, particularly in the big cities of the Atlantic seaboard, the unloading points of the mass immigration. New York does not give the visitor the impression of a homogeneous and well balanced population. The mass of people moving along Broadway and Fifth Avenue contains not only whites, but many Negroes, yellow skinned people, and mixtures which cannot be classified by the colors of their skin. And if one looks at the names over the shops, then those of non Anglo Saxon origin, Italian, Hungarian, Balkan, or Russian, greatly outnumber the others. By contrast, the German names, which one sees everywhere, begin to appear almost native. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, and San Francisco all offer a replica of the spectacle provided by the streets of New York. But these big cosmopolitan towns, centers of assimilation, are not the whole country. They are not even the ethnic axis of the country. That axis remains Anglo-Saxon, though if there is still an Anglo-Saxon majority, it must have become very narrow. I think it's something like 20%. Don't quote me on that, but last time I looked, I think it's about 20% these days. When he was writing, maybe it was more like 30, 35, 40%. Although I do have a book here called The Dispossessed Majority. I can't remember the writer now, which argues that it may have even been smaller back then as well. Anyway, if you look at an American crowd or at a group of Americans, you are struck by the fact that physically the various types are strangely different. There are blondes, browns and chestnuts, blue eyes and dark eyes, fair complexions and dark complexions, dolichocephalics and brachycephalics, tall, well-made people and short people. There can certainly be no question of any American race. But is there at least an American people? Let us examine the question. And if anybody can answer this question, it will be Siegfried, won't it? Because he's gone through all the other peoples of Europe as well. So let's see. Can one really say that there is an American people as there is a French, or an English, or a German people? Or to approach the problem from another angle, is it possible to define an American psychology? So far, we have spread out the most varied and singularly disparate elements for examination. Let us now ask ourselves whether these elements, stirred together in the famous melting pot, have ended up by constituting a specific individuality. Assimilation, from the standpoint of the descendant of the old Puritans, means turning the immigrant into an Anglo-Saxon. Israel Zwangville conceived the operation in a larger and more mystical spirit. And this is a quote from Zangwill. America is God's crucible, the great melting pot where all the races of Europe are melting and reforming. The real American has not yet arrived. He is only in the crucible.
¿Vienes con los niños? Buenísimo. ¿No viene el tío Paco? Sí.
This is Siegfried again. Has he arrived yet? And if he has, does he conform to the narrow conception of Protestant nationalism or to the larger conception of the idealistic Jew? The question arises today in quite a different fashion. And it's funny, isn't it? Because that is still being debated now, right? All over my timeline, I see basically a rearticulation of those two visions of America. I guess you'd call it Protestant nationalism and the idealistic Jewish vision. Those are frequently contrasted in today's politics because American nationalism is a live question under Donald Trump today. The question arises today in quite a different fashion. But since the end of the 19th century, there has been a complete transformation of American society involving not only the cosmopolitan and nature of the people, but also the economic and technical conditions in which they live. The Industrial Revolution, the introduction of the mechanical age born of the steam engine, has revealed all its consequences only during the past half a century. And it is in the United States in particular that these consequences have been most profound and most revolutionary. The turning point seems to have been the First World War. The curious thing is that the making of the American people was further advanced at the end of the 19th century than it is today. I have been in a position to make the comparison, and after 1918, I was definitely impressed by a feeling that something had started up again, that it was not only a question of development, but of the birth of a new civilization, a civilization which did not develop from the former one, but had its roots elsewhere. It is from this standpoint that we must examine the America of today if we hope to understand her at all. When the third wave of immigration, the Slavo-Latin wave, rolled over America, an original and quite distinct civilization had already developed there based on the principles evolved in the 17th and 18th centuries and applied in 19th century conditions of development. The German, Irish, and Jewish contributions had left their mark on the original English foundation, whilst a Catholic element had developed side by side with the original Protestant stock. We can still recall, though today only as a fading memory, some of the representative types since become legendary of that period. First of all, there was Uncle Sam himself, popularized everywhere in cartoons, with his white goatee beard, his striped trousers, and his blue waistcoat spangled with stars. And then there was the famous American uncle, who had gone off to the States with a few coppers in his pocket to make a vast fortune, which he then left to his astonished heirs in the old country. There was also the captain of industry and the business mogul, something of a buccaneer. He was, floating railway and mining companies, speculating unscrupulously and vacillating between gigantic bankruptcies and prodigious success. And then there was the Irish boss, of whom there are, incidentally, a few examples left even in our own day, and the 400 of Fifth Avenue and Newport, of whom our 200 families represent a very pale reflection. The aristocracy of New England, people like Henry Adams, were a sort of American English, cultivated, refined, and already rich, with a wealth inherited from their parents. I think Henry Adams is the brother of Brooks Adams, who I talk about in Prophets of Doom, incidentally, who are descended from John Adams, the original, one of the original presidents. Anyway, so Henry Adams was a sort of American English, cultivated, refined, already rich, with a wealth inherited from their parents, living the comfortable, to us, luxurious life of men and women who have never had to bother their heads about money. The quote-unquote beautiful American of 1900, very different from the still beautiful American of our day, was much grander and more important. She took up far more space with the immense hats of the period. She made us think of some great actress or other in the grand style. English, Irish, and Dutch types were more frequently met with back then, and except in the South, the Negroes were less visible, and there were fewer Mediterranean and Balkan types, and fewer Dagos of all kinds. It struck one as being physically a different race from the Americans of today, and in fact it was. There was also a different conception of life, founded on individual enterprise, and the government did not dream of interfering in the lives of its citizens except to punish crime and to put down horse thieving. The result was a certain confusion, the background to frantic speculation and adventure, and the frontier was still open to the West, offering unlimited possibilities to anyone who was determined to make his way in life. Go west, young man, was the extortion fired at any young fellow who girded against social constraint. The American of that era had a taste for the outlandish, which has since died out. The Englishman of Jules Verne was always represented as an energetic character, but supremely solid, whilst his American was something of an eccentric, prepared to risk everything, a builder certainly, but a little harebrained.